Greetings. This is Rich Gierman, and this is the Safe Passage for Children updated training for the 2013 legislative session. This is preparation for the Day on the Hill next Thursday, March 21st, as well as any other meetings you may have scheduled with your legislators. This is background for you, and we will also have handouts and other materials available for you when you get to the session. Now, I have noticed with GoToMeeting.com that it takes a long time before it starts going through slides. And there we go. So what is the Safe Passage Bill? We'll go over what's in it and what isn't. The bill numbers are Senate file or SF 704 and House file 1106. Our sponsors or the chief authors on the bills are Senator Jeff Hayden and Representative Susan Allen. The purpose of the bill is to implement the Office of Legislative Auditor's recommendations from their 2012 report on child protection screening practices. So what the bill does, first it incorporates the Department of Human Services guidelines for what, quote, counts, unquote, as child abuse and neglect in Minnesota into statute so that they have the force of law. This comes from the Legislative Auditor's finding that the guidelines as they're currently constituted from DHS are only, quote, advice, unquote, to the counties. And the counties have layered on top of this their own local practices, even down to the local office level, community expectations. So basically, they refer to the DHS guidelines, but they develop their own local version of their standards and definitions of child protection. And this, as we will see as we go, led to a lot of inconsistencies and very broad variation in how different reports of abuse and neglect are screened in different parts of the state. The original idea was in the Legislative Auditor's report was to promulgate rules which have the force of law, but they're rather complicated to do and take a long time. They're rather inflexible and hard to change. So with advice from Senate Counsel, it seemed the more flexible thing to do would be to simply incorporate the guidelines into statute, and then as the department may revise them or update them, they still are in the statute, so it has the force of law, and counties are accountable to them in a way they are not now. The law, secondly, establishes a work group, and its purpose will be to clarify the definitions and standards that were recommended by OLA, and examples of the things that OLA said needed to be clarified. In other words, better definitions and better guidance for screeners are situations regarding the presence of a registered sex offender in the home, incidents or patterns of domestic violence, and when they rise to the level of a child protection issue, use of weapons to intimidate children, insufficient food, presence of certain drugs, or a pattern of drug or alcohol abuse. So there's a lot of clarification guidance needed in terms of when those issues become ones that should be screened into child protection. And the law requires the work group to consult with stakeholders. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The bill also requires counties to keep records of reports that are screened out. The auditor found that there are varying practices across the state ranging from not keeping any information at all to keeping enough information to be able to identify when screened out reports are followed up by yet another report and another report. But yet, and even in those cases, counties are sporadic about when they put it into the state computer system, SSIS, and also some counties have a policy that they will keep this information but will not consider it and when there's a repeat report. The auditor spent a fair amount of time pointing out situations in the law currently which require one to be able to identify patterns of abuse and neglect. So medical neglect or insufficient food that over time suggests a pattern of deliberately depriving children of food, and those sorts of situations that develop over time, and each incident may not in itself reach the level of a child protection case. So clearly what the auditor's recommendation was is that the department identify the minimum set of information needed to see patterns of abuse and neglect and require counties to consistently put that information about screened out reports into the computer system, and to consider the history of child protection in their screening decisions. Instead, the department issued guidelines which said that the only information has to be kept is the number of children in a report and the fact that there was a report, and actually said affirmatively that counties may not consider a history of child abuse or screening decisions or screened out reports in their deliberations. In other words, each report must stand on its own. Clearly not what the auditor intended or what's currently in state law. So this bill will require counties to consider history, and it also has language in terms of defining the minimum information needed to do that. And finally, we added something in the bill since it was originally proposed, which would require the department to include some child welfare organizations in a proposal that they are developing for a federal planning grant. This is a grant which would be a significant amount of money, over $600,000 a year for 5 years, to develop the kind of infrastructure that has been discussed in many settings where we can identify child abuse issues more effectively and do screening and assessment for children so that each time they come into the system or while they're in the system, we can see if as a result of being involved with child protection, they are doing better or worse. So there's an accountability piece there and a measurement piece, and then also to develop an infrastructure of evidence-based interventions. And so we at Safe Passage have been talking with the federal people who are responsible for this grant, and they've indicated that we would have a much better chance as a state of getting winning that grant proposal if we had a broader group of stakeholders involved. So that is included in the bill as well. So what's removed from the bill is we originally had a feasibility study in there of a centralized state unit, a hotline, that would screen all reports of child abuse and neglect. This would be as a way to get more consistency, be able to do quality control, more transparent reporting, and so forth. But it was of considerable concern to the counties and the department, and also the research is mixed on this. It's not clear when these units do better or worse, or what the factors are than traditional screening, local screening processes. So we decided to put it on the side. We can bring it back next year if that seems appropriate, and do a little more homework between now and then. That means that the very large work group that was in the original bill is no longer as necessary. What the remaining work will be is to focus on the OLA recommendations related to child maltreatment standards and definitions, and so the group becomes smaller and becomes more of an expert group in child protection, early childhood issues, impact of trauma and brain development, those sorts of things. But the bill requires that work group to consult with stakeholders who understand actually what the practices are on the ground in child protection in local agencies. So that would be organizations such as crisis nurseries, school staff like social workers and nurses and teachers, guardians ad litem, youth workers, members of citizen review panel, and child welfare nonprofits. So that's a piece that has been changed in the bill from a large work group to a much more focused group that's with experts. So in preparation for your visit, we are going to provide a sheet with talking points so that you can kind of check off and make sure you've covered what you need to. And one story that I'll go into in a bit more detail shortly, the Howard case, because often that's effective to talk about a very specific case. A handout to leave with your legislators so that they can, take away what you told them. And some information on your own senator and representative, so you have a sense of who they are, and also particularly if it seems like our bill is likely to come up in a committee that they are on. Of course, we want to talk with everybody because our hope is that the committee will get to both the House and Senate floor and will be passed there. So in that case, everyone will be able to vote on it, all of the senators and representatives. But the most important thing is to leave time to tell your story. Why did you come down on that particular day? Why do you care about what's going on with children who are abused and neglected? As we have talked about often, this is usually the most influential part of the visit, and especially if you have direct experience as a school person or a guardian or whatever with the system, this is the place to share it. That's very powerful. And in fact, we may sometimes only have a few minutes with your elected officials. Perhaps they're on the floor of the House and Senate and we have to pull them out, and there's a vote coming up, so I'll ask you to be brief. In those kind of circumstances, I would suggest that you just say that you're a volunteer with Safe Passage and you are asking for their support in this bill, and that you would like to tell them about your experience with child protection and foster care and why you think that it needs some attention. Then if you have time, you can go back and kind of walk them through the provisions in the bill. But the most important thing is to say this bill will help to address some of the circumstances that you're concerned about. Okay, a couple of examples you can use if the legislator is interested in more details. There will be information on the Howard case in the handout and on your talking points as well. We went over this in the earlier training, so you can look that up if you want to see it there. You can go back to the website and look up the original training. But I'll briefly go back over it. It's an example of a severe case of neglect, a real live case. It showed up around Thanksgiving. And it is a situation with a 35-pound, 3.5-foot tall boy who's 8 or 9 years old. And is about half the size that he should be for his age. He had been systematically starved and sometimes beaten, locked in a basement room for at least a year, and certainly had been deprived of food prior to that. And he was suffering from a slow heartbeat. His brain had atrophied and his bones were protruding from his body. He was locked in a room, and his parents or his siblings stayed outside the room to make sure he didn't, quote, steal food. His siblings were required to take him out twice a week and hose him down to keep him clean. He had to sleep in a plastic sled. And this is a Department of Human Services licensed foster care home. They had just relicensed it 6 months prior to when this incident came to light. As far as we know, there's no foster children in the home, but they had adopted, the department had them adopt 3, this boy and 2 siblings. The police had found him wandering around looking for food in 2011. There's no record of any report from the police to the county child protection people. A dentist saw enamel coming off his teeth. There's no way to tell if the dentist reported that situation or not. And then when the case was first reported this fall, the department in Nicollet County placed it in family assessment, a voluntary program, and they didn't actually investigate what was going on until they got the 2nd and 3rd report and 4th report in short order. So this bill addresses that in a couple of ways. First of all, it will be difficult for counties to repeatedly screen out cases without being able to account for why they would record calls on 10, 15, 20, 25 times on a child and never go out. And it also will clarify that this is clearly a case that should be screened in. In the legislative auditor report, they found that that some counties will screen in a case anytime there's an allegation that children are deprived of food. And another county said they would only screen in a case of that nature if the child was in the bottom 5th percentile of height and weight, which clearly would be something like this Howard case, and completely not appropriate to screen, only to wait until a child is at that point to screen it in. So by clarifying these guidelines and making them part of the law, there will be a significantly increased accountability or requirements for counties to pay attention to that and to screen appropriately. There will still be, of course, room for judgment. There are always judgment calls, but these are situations where that are clearly not within reasonable practice. So then, in terms of an abuse case, as I mentioned, the legislative auditor found wide variations in standards related to abuse in these areas that I've mentioned. So one example we might use is, and this is not a real-life example, this is a vignette that the legislative auditor used to try to tease out what the practices are at the local level. And in this particular vignette, workers were asked if they would screen in a report where a father brandished a gun and then shot the boy's dog in front of him. Now, this is a fairly clear-cut case. It's of abuse. It's called terrorizing, and it's considered both mental abuse and imminent threat of harm to child. It rises right up to the top. And it's an example, almost identical to an example used by the American Humane Association to illustrate what terrorizing is. But 45% of the caseworkers that the auditor surveyed said they would not screen in the case. And 55% said they would, and we don't know what their standards are in terms of maybe they're much more likely to screen in cases that are milder. We don't really know, but that's an example that there's such a range that we have across the state, and also that in some situations we're clearly out of line with what accepted standards and practices are. So that is essentially the what we're doing, and please feel free to check with me or Jana if you have questions about this, and we will see you down at the Capitol, and I hope this is helpful background for next week. Thanks very much.